Jake Miller had been a long-haul truck driver for nearly 12 years, and he prided himself on knowing America's highways like the back of his hand. But one night in rural Colorado, everything changed. He was hauling a late load toward Denver when his GPS suggested a shortcut to save nearly 30 minutes. Jake hesitated at first. Truckers knew better than to blindly trust back road directions, but he was running behind schedule, so he took the exit. The road was narrow and cracked, lined with tall pines that seemed to swallow the moonlight. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just the steady hum of his engine. After a few miles, Jake noticed something strange. His GPS no longer showed his position. The blue arrow was gone. The map froze, then went completely blank. He frowned and tapped the screen, but the signal was dead. A service. Nothing unusual for remote Colorado, he thought, until he realized he hadn't seen a single road sign since leaving the highway. As the miles stretched on, an uneasy feeling crept in. The asphalt beneath his wheels looked older than it should have, faded and cracked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Jake rolled his window down and leaned out slightly. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Then, through the darkness, he spotted headlights up ahead. Relieved, he slowed slightly, expecting to pass another trucker or maybe a late-night traveler. But as the vehicle approached, his relief curdled into dread. It wasn't a truck. It was an old, beat-up sedan from the 1960s, paint-chipped and rust crawling up its sides. Its headlights were dim and yellowed, flickering faintly like dying candles. As it passed, Jake got a quick glance inside. There were 4 people seated inside, completely motionless, their heads turned unnaturally toward him, as if in perfect unison. Their faces were pale, almost gray, and their eyes, wide, glassy, lifeless. Before Jake could process what he'd seen, the car vanished into his rearview mirror, but there was no sound, no engine, no tires crunching against the asphalt. Nothing. His chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, but the road was too narrow, and he didn't want to risk getting his rig stuck. Instead, he pushed forward, gripping the wheel tighter as the pine forest closed in around him. A few minutes later, he spotted a faded sign up ahead, its paint peeling and barely legible. As he passed, his stomach dropped when he made out the words, "Dunning Road, closed since 1974. Jake slammed the brakes. The trailer screeched behind him, his heart pounding in his ears. Pulled out his phone to double-check, hoping this was some bizarre prank, but when he searched for Dunning Road, nothing came up. It didn't exist on Google Maps. It didn't exist anywhere. He shoved the phone back into the cup holder and kept driving, hoping he'd eventually hit an intersection or town. But then he noticed something even stranger. The temperature inside the cab started to drop. His breath fogged the windshield, and his fingers stiffened against the wheel. And then he saw it. Barely illuminated by his headlights was a gas station. Old, abandoned. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the sign above the awning looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. But what made his blood run cold was the man standing beneath the flickering canopy lights. He was tall, dressed in faded overalls, his skin as pale as chalk. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, facing Jake's truck. Jake slowed, debating whether to stop, when the man suddenly raised his arm and pointed, not at Jake, but behind him. Confused, Jake looked into the side mirror. His heart nearly stopped. The old sedan from earlier was right behind him, but now it was closer, impossibly close. Its headlights glowed faintly, but inside the car, the 4 figures were still sitting perfectly still, heads turned, all staring directly at him. Jake floored the accelerator, roaring past the gas station, the trailer rattling violently as he pushed the truck past its limits. But no matter how fast he went, the sedan stayed right on his tail. The faint hum of his dying engine somehow grew louder, vibrating through his bones. Then, without warning, the sedan's headlights flickered, and went completely out. In his mirror, the car was just gone. No brake lights, no engine noise, nothing. Jake kept driving, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to breathe, trying to shake the panic clawing at his throat. After a few minutes, he thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. That's when he saw the sign up ahead. Welcome to Dunning. Population 263. Jake slowed as he approached the small wooden marker, but something didn't add up. There were no houses, no street lamps, no power lines, just the endless forest stretching on both sides. And then he noticed the back of the sign, visible in his mirror as he passed. The paint was faded, but the words were still legible. Dunning, Colorado, abandoned 1974. His stomach churned. That was impossible. He checked his odometer. He'd been driving nearly 30 minutes, but there was no turnoff, no crossroad, no way back to the highway. It was like the road had swallowed him whole. Then his CB radio crackled to life. Static at first, then a voice, low, uneven, whispering, "Turn round." Jake froze, staring at the radio, but before he could respond, the voice came again, louder this time, distorted like multiple people speaking at once. "Turn round now." He grabbed the mic and shouted, "Who is this? Where the hell am I?" Silence, and then, just barely audible beneath the static, came a single sentence that made his blood run cold. "You're not supposed to be here." Jake slammed the radio down, panic overtaking reason. He turned the wheel hard, desperate to reverse back down the road, but the moment his headlights swung across the tree line, he saw them. Dozens of figures, standing shoulder to shoulder among the pines, perfectly still, pale faces staring, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of his headlights. He froze, his hands shaking violently against the wheel. The figures didn't move, didn't blink, but then one of them stepped forward. Kate was the man from the gas station. Okay. Jake slammed the truck into reverse, spinning the wheel wildly, the trailer fishtailing as he gunned it down the road. He didn't look back, not once. He just kept driving until, somehow, impossibly, the cracked pavement beneath him turned smooth again. A glowing green highway sign appeared ahead. Exit 17, the same one he'd taken 30 minutes earlier. But when he merged back onto the interstate and checked his rearview mirror, there was no road behind him at all, just unbroken forest. No Dunning Road, no gas station, nothing. When Jake finally stopped at a truck stop an hour later, he pulled out his phone and searched again, this time digging through old archives. After scrolling for nearly half an hour, he found it, a newspaper article from 1974. It read, "Town of Dunning, abandoned after mysterious fire. 263 dead. Road permanently closed." Jake never took shortcuts again. But sometimes, late at night, when he's hauling cargo through Colorado, his GPS would glitch. The map will freeze. And no matter where he is, no matter how far from Dunning, one message always flashes across the top of the screen before the signal cuts out completely. Rerouting via Dunning Road. Ethan Cole had been hiking these woods since he was a teenager, tucked deep inside the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. This trail was one of his favorites. Quiet, isolated, untouched. He'd walked it dozens of times before, but that afternoon felt different. The air was heavier, damp from the morning rain. A mist curled around the trees, and the path ahead of him vanished into a gray haze. Normally, he liked the silence out here, but this silence felt wrong. He slowed his pace, scanning the woods around him. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the branches, just stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there. That was when he noticed something odd, a patch of earth just off the trail where the ground looked disturbed. At first, Ethan thought maybe an animal had dug there, but as he stepped closer, he saw it wasn't random at all. There was a wooden cross sticking out of the dirt. He stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't unusual to see makeshift memorials in the mountains. Hikers sometimes left them for loved ones who had died on the trails. But this one was different. The dirt around the cross was freshly turned, like someone had been there very recently. A flat piece of stone leaned against the cross, carved roughly by hand. He crouched down to read it, and his breath caught in his throat. It had his name on it, Ethan Cole. Not just his first name, his full name, and below it, his exact birth date. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a coincidence. There had to be someone else out there with the same name, the same date. But what were the odds of finding a grave here on this exact trail that matched him perfectly? Suddenly, the woods around him didn't feel empty anymore. He stood up quickly, scanning the fog-filled trees. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. He took a step back toward the trail, and that's when he heard it, a faint crunch of leaves. Ethan froze. His eyes darted around, heart hammering in his chest, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, silence again. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move, one step at a time, back to the trail. His breathing was loud now, too loud in the quiet. And then, just as he was about to leave the clearing, a whisper slid through the mist. "Ethan." He whipped around so fast, he nearly slipped on the damp ground. Nothing. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. That was enough. He ran. Branches slapped against his arms, mud splashed under his boots, and the fog blurred everything into shades of gray. He didn't look back. He didn't want to know what was behind him, or worse, who. When he finally burst out of the woods and into the gravel parking lot, he was gasping for air. His car was the only one there, sitting in the silence like it had been waiting for him. He fumbled for his keys, yanked the door open, and climbed inside, locking the doors instantly. But before he could start the engine, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the edge of the tree line, a tall figure, motionless, half hidden by the fog. Ethan blinked, and when his eyes focused again, it was gone. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, replaying the image of the grave over and over in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his name carved into stone. Every creak of his Nashville apartment made his chest tighten. By 2:30 a.m., he gave up and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling on his laptop. He searched for missing hikers, unsolved cases, anything that could explain the grave he'd seen. That's when he found an old article from the late 1970s. Between 1975 and 1978, there had been 6 disappearances near the exact trail he'd been hiking. Hikers, campers, even a park ranger. No bodies were ever recovered. Locals started calling the area Dead Man's Hollow. Ethan's throat went dry, according to one hunter interviewed at the time. He'd once stumbled across empty graves in those woods, freshly dug, waiting to be filled. Ethan slammed his laptop shut. He couldn't explain why, but something deep inside him whispered that the grave he saw wasn't a coincidence. Someone had put it there, for him. The following days only made things worse. He started hearing things, soft knock at his apartment door in the middle of the night, the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway outside. He'd look through the peephole, and there'd be nothing there. Then came the dreams. In them, he was back in the woods, standing over the grave. But this time, the earth wasn't flat. The soil was bulging upward, like something inside was pushing against it, trying to claw its way out. On the 4th night, he woke up drenched in sweat and found dirt under his fingernails. That was when Ethan decided he had to go back. He had to see if the grave was really there, if any of this was real or just in his head. 2 days later, he returned to the trail. The air was heavier than before, the forest eerily quiet. When he reached the clearing where he'd first found the grave, His stomach twisted. It was gone. The cross, the stone, the disturbed earth. Everything had vanished. The ground looked untouched, like it had never been there. But in the exact spot where the grave had been, something else sat on the grass. A small wooden box. Ethan hesitated, then knelt down and picked it up. The wood was damp, cold to the touch. He flipped the lid open with trembling fingers. Inside was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly. 4 words. "See you tonight, Ethan." He dropped the note instantly and stumbled backward. The woods were silent, but now he felt them closing in on him, pressing against him. And then the whisper came again. This time it wasn't behind him. It was right next to his ear. "Keithan." He ran. By the time he reached his car, his lungs were burning, but he froze as soon as he saw it. On the driver's seat, resting neatly on the leather, was another folded note. Same jagged handwriting. "Graves, don't stay empty." Ethan's hands shook as he backed away from the car, staring into the tree line. When he saw movement, a figure standing exactly where the grave had been. Only this time, it wasn't standing still. It was digging. Jake and Melissa had been saving for months for their trip to Maine. They'd booked a cozy Airbnb cabin near Bar Harbor, tucked away in the woods, but close enough to the coastline to enjoy the view. The listing had called it a rustic retreat. Wood panel walls, an old stone fireplace, big bay windows overlooking the forest. Perfect for a quiet week away. They arrived just before sunset. The driveway was a winding stretch of gravel cutting through dense pine trees. By the time Jake parked, the crickets had started their evening chorus, and the air smelled of salt and wet earth. Inside, the cabin looked exactly like the photos, except for one thing. Above the fireplace hung a large, framed portrait of a woman. Her pale face was lit by candlelight, her black hair falling in loose waves, her dress an old-fashioned Victorian style. But it wasn't her beauty that unsettled Melissa, it was her eyes. Even though the woman's expression was neutral, the deep shadows painted beneath her eyes made her look exhausted, haunted. Melissa frowned. This wasn't in the listing pictures, was it? Jake shook his head. Nope. Weird. Still, they brushed it off. Old cabins were full of odd decorations. They unpacked, made dinner, and poured themselves wine. By 11 p.m., they were curled up on the couch, the fireplace crackling softly. When Melissa noticed something, the portrait, she swore. Absolutely swore. The woman's head was tilted slightly more to the left than before. "Jake," she whispered, nudging him. "Look at her. Was she always like that?" He squinted. "You're imagining it." She stared at the painting for another few seconds, shook her head, and forced herself to let it go. By midnight, they went to bed. When they woke the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows. The eerie tension from last night felt silly in the daylight. Jake made coffee. Melissa started eggs, and everything felt perfectly normal until she walked into the living room. The portrait was gone. "Jake," her voice cracked slightly. He came over, wiping his hands on a towel, and stopped dead when he saw the bare wall above the fireplace. "What the hell?" he muttered. Neither of them had touched the painting. They searched the entire cabin, behind furniture, inside closets, under the bed, but the portrait was nowhere. "Maybe the owner came by," Melissa offered weakly, but Jake shook his head. They'd checked the door and the windows that morning. Everything was locked from the inside. They spent the day hiking Acadia National Park, trying to shake the weirdness, but Melissa couldn't stop thinking about that woman's face. That night, when they returned to the cabin, the portrait was back. Same place, same angle, same cold, glassy eyes. Melissa's breath hitched. "Jake." "It wasn't there this morning." Jake nodded slowly, his expression tense now. "I know." They didn't touch it. They didn't even sit in the living room. Instead, they retreated to the bedroom early, locking the door behind them. But around 2:30 a.m., Melissa woke up suddenly. Something was dripping. She sat up, groggy, trying to locate the sound. The steady tap, tap, tap echoed faintly through the cabin. She glanced at Jake. He was still asleep, and reluctantly slid out of bed. The sound led her into the living room. She froze. The portrait was on the floor. The frame had fallen, and the glass had shattered. But it wasn't the broken glass that made her chest tighten. It was the painting itself. It had changed. The woman's pale face was now streaked with what looked like dark tears. Her mouth hung slightly open, as though caught mid-breath, and her once empty hands were now pressed against the inside of the canvas, like she was trying to push her way out. Melissa screamed. Jake ran from the bedroom, grabbing her shoulders, demanding to know what happened. When he saw the portrait, his face drained of color. They didn't argue this time. They didn't debate. They packed their bags in silence and were out the door in under 5 minutes. They checked into a motel that night, a cheap place off Route 3. By morning, Melissa convinced Jake to call the Airbnb host and demand an explanation. When the line finally connected, an elderly woman answered, her voice soft but strained. Jake explained everything, the portrait, the changes, the break-in. But when he finished, the woman was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something that made Melissa's skin crawl. "There shouldn't be any portraits in that cabin," the host whispered. "Not since the fire." "What fire?" Jake asked. "The cabin burned down in 1989, the woman said flatly. "We rebuilt it on the same foundation, but there was a girl who died inside. Her name was Annabelle. Locals say she doesn't rest easy." Melissa's voice shook as she asked, "What did she look like?" The woman hesitated. "Black hair, pale skin, or a white dress most days." "Why?" Melissa hung up without answering. They decided to leave Maine early, but on the drive back to Boston, Melissa kept glancing at the back seat through the rearview mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling someone was sitting there, just out of sight. That night, they returned to their apartment, exhausted but relieved to be home, until Melissa stepped into the living room and froze. There, above their fireplace, hung the same portrait, but this time, the woman wasn't staring off to the side. She was staring straight at them.